Welcome to Spoiler Warning, where today we're going to talk about Iron Man and what he's actually been doing from Iron Man 1 all the way to Age of Ultron. Then we're going to talk about his abilities, powers, as well as his armor. And then we will talk about what actually happened in the comic version of Civil War and how Iron Man worked through that. Iron Man was actually the first glimpse we got into a Marvel shared universe, and it was actually pretty goddamn good with Iron Man because we got Tony Stark being played by a guy who was basically the real life embodiment of Tony Stark and Robert Downey Jr. As we start out, we actually have Tony starting out as a rich billionaire weapons designer, and his lack of give a fuck for anything else in the world but making money. Tony not giving a shit also kind of came back and bit him in the ass, as his weapons almost killed him by penetrating his body with metal shards that almost went into his heart, but were actually held at bay by an arc reactor he created while held prisoner that kept it from entering his heart. The arc reactor also ended up powering his shoddy made Iron Man Mark I that helped him to escape and get back to the United States. After getting back to the United States, Tony decided no more weapons. Fuck that shit. Obadiah Stane, who actually ran Stark Industries while Tony was held captive, was actually the guy who had set up the kidnapping in the first place and was hoping that Tony would actually die so he could take over. And I was pretty goddamn pissed whenever Tony showed back up, and then whenever he said they were no longer making any sort of weapons. Obadiah decided that he was going to recreate the Iron Man armor and use it to be sold just like any other weapon. The only problem is Tony was the only one who knew how to make the arc reactor, and Obadiah couldn't figure out how to recreate it. So Obadiah goes and he steals Tony's arc reactor. Tony, deciding he needed to fix shit, goes and uses his old arc reactor, which has nowhere near as much power, but Obadiah hasn't made it so that his Ironmonger armor could not freeze over in higher atmospheres, which Tony had figured out earlier. After falling back to Earth, Obadiah was also blown up by the arc reactor that Tony had made whenever he was younger, that was the size of a fucking trailer, and it ended up blowing up Obadiah and the Ironmonger armor. Tony also shows up at the end of the Incredible Hulk, which is the first time we've had any of the heroes move across to different superhero movies, and he was actually in a bar with General Thunderbolt Ross, who was actually going to try to capture the Incredible Hulk. Tony actually finds a newfound popularity after he just comes out and says, "I am Iron Man," except for he has issues with being poisoned by his own arc reactor core because of the different metal inside is poisoning his body, as well as an enemy that shows up who is mad because his dad helped Tony's dad create the arc reactor in the first place, but he gets no credit, as well as the United States government trying to take the Iron Man armor because they say it's a weapon. Because of Tony dying because he's being poisoned by the arc reactor, he actually starts to act extremely reckless, and Rhodey actually ends up stealing one of the Iron Man armors, saying that he doesn't deserve it, and takes it to the United States government to be used for military purposes. Nick Fury and S.H.I.E.L.D. actually show up, and they give Tony his dad's old research and stuff, where he had actually come up with a new element that Tony can use as a different power source for his core that no longer poisons him and actually reverses the poison that is already in his body. The military actually ends up creating military drone Iron Man, and the armor that Rhodes stole ends up becoming War Machine armor, and they are controlled by Ivan Vanko, who's the guy who's pissed off because his dad's research was never given any credit. In the end, Tony ends up saving Rhodes and getting control back of the armor, and the two of them come back to fight, destroy the drones, and destroy Vanko or Whiplash. When Tony and the Avengers actually come together, he is better at dividing them initially and starting fights from within. But near the end of the fight, he actually goes from full of himself and totally self-centered to team player, and willing to sacrifice himself to save the world. As we start out Iron Man 3, or as I like to call it, the movie where they fucked up the Mandarin, Tony has PTSD from the Battle of Manhattan with all the fucking aliens and shit, where he almost died saving the world. Tony keeps having panic attacks, and for actually most of the movie isn't even Iron Man, because the Iron Man armor gets messed up after he calls out the Mandarin. Tony is just kind of fucking MacGyver at this point, because he's making shit out of garden variety gear. Near the end of the movie, he actually gets his armor back together, and all of the extra armors he had made during the time he hadn't slept because of the PTSD, and fights against a shitty version of extremists that they had made for this movie. As you can tell, I fucking hate this goddamn movie. At the end of Iron Man 3, Tony had seemed to have given up on being Iron Man, and actually had the arc reactor removed from his chest, as well as the metal bits that were going to kill him without the arc reactor. At the beginning of Age of Ultron, Tony has actually gone above and beyond and has created a legion of Iron Men to police the world, while the Avengers do what the Avengers do. The problem comes where Tony takes Loki's scepter and takes the mind gem from that, creating an AI, which ends up creating Ultron, who says, fuck the humans, they're the issue with the world, and we have to kill them all. When the other Avengers find out what he's done, they're pretty pissed off, but Tony also holds himself accountable, which he actually should, because, well, he's the one who fucked up. Tony actually shows up and fights the Hulk in some Hulkbuster armor after the Hulk is mind-controlled by the Scarlet Witch, and that's pretty badass. Then Tony starts to go a little crazy again and decides that the body that Ultron is making for himself, you should probably use that against Ultron, because, you know, the AI thing worked out so goddamn well the first time. The thing is, this time it actually does work out, because you get the Vision. And the Vision's pretty badass, and I mean, he can hold the goddamn Thor's hammer. So Iron Man and the Avengers go off to Sokovia to go stop Ultron from his master plan of dropping the entire goddamn country of Sokovia down on the world and creating an extinction event. In the end, Ultron dies, Quicksilver dies, I mean, spoiler warning, and the day is saved. Tony Stark is actually one of the top 4 smartest people on the entire planet, and is actually a master engineer, master scientist, expert hacker, as well as an expert tactician. That's all without his armor. His armor lets him fly, extra durability, superhuman strength, has the heads-up display with Jarvis or Friday now that helps him out, and it gives him superhuman reflexes. In the comic book version of Civil War, the reason for the superhuman registration is completely different, but the key story remains the same, that the government wants superhumans to register with them so that the government controls when and where they actually fight crime. Tony Stark is 100% for this, which is easy to say for a guy who's already publicly come out as Iron Man. In the movies, it makes a little bit more sense because he created Ultron, he created the Iron Legion, and he just completely fucked shit up. In the comic books, he's just kind of a complete and total asshole. And if they were trying to do it where it was 50-50 who you would side with, no. It was, you side with Iron Man, and you're a fucking asshole, because he makes no goddamn sense. He just did stupid shit, like Thor didn't exist at that point. He was dead or gone or something or other. So Tony made a fucking Thor clone that ended up going batshit and killing a superhero, which is pretty fucked up on its own, because it's a superhero even if he is technically doing an illegal thing. Tony in Civil War ended up actually making a prison in an alternate universe, and if anybody was arrested for not registering, they didn't have any due process or anything. They just went directly to jail. They did not pass go. They did not collect $200. And that was pretty messed up, because most of the people in there were superheroes that used to be friends of Iron Man, and he just straight up said, fuck you guys, I'm done. In the end, after Steve had died, he turned himself in because he didn't want any death. Because even though he was in the right, the fighting had ended up causing lots of damage and death, and Steve didn't want to have any of it anymore because he wasn't an asshole. So he turned himself in, and as he was going to trial, he was actually assassinated. In the end, Iron Man apologized to the dead body of Steve, which that shit doesn't help. And he kind of just washed away all of the Civil War stuff and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, blah, blah, blah." After Civil War had actually been completed, Marvel realized they'd messed up with Tony and had made him a complete and total asshole, and they actually retconned everything and made it like his mind was messed up somehow. So they wiped his brain and rebooted back to an earlier version where Civil War never happened to him. So they can basically wipe their hands of all the Civil War, and he's not asshole to him. In this movie version of Civil War, it actually does seem a lot more 50-50 because of the Ultron incident. Stark wants to be accountable, but then there's also Captain America's side, which still makes sense because of the whole freedom. I mean, we're in America, right? So it's 50-50. If you choose one side or the other, you're not an asshole in this one. So it's going to be a lot better, I think. The fights are going to be awesome, and with so many of the characters in this movie actually being dead in the comic version, or missing in the comic version, there's a lot of unpredictability in this movie. If you like this video, like, subscribe, and come back tomorrow as we talk about Captain America. The video is a lot different today because I had some criticism that it felt too scripted, so I ad-libbed all of it. I cussed a fuck ton because, well, I was in the Navy, and I cussed like a sailor. If you don't like the way this goes, comment down below and let me know what you liked, what you don't like, and also, as always, what heroes or villains you'd like to see a video of in the future.